Onto a serious subject, though. On October 31, 2018, due to a series of missteps by medical providers and over at Guam Memorial Hospital, this is something confirmed by the Center by a report from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, confirmed by a settlement that GMH had with a man named David Lebowski, whose son, on October 31, 2018, in the early morning hours while he was holding him, died in his arms at Guam Memorial Hospital. Findings from the report showing malpractice. And since then, David Lebowski, Asher Dean Lebowski, has been the call. His story has been the call to action to our leaders, to the Guam legislature and the governor, to do something about a law that, unlike the Lebowskis who had the resources to fight this, so many others, his father took this call on in memory of his son. David Lebowski took on this mantle, and against so many odds, and while the medical community, many in the medical community were fighting against this man who lost his son without even giving him the reverence or the respect that he deserved as a father of a son who was killed by medical malpractice, he was pissed upon by these rich people, made to be seen as someone who was emotionally unstable just because he was grieving for his son, and he was fighting for everybody else who was not as fortunate as he was, not as blessed as he was, to have the resources to fight against the man. And he took this call on, he took this mantle, he took this fight to the powers that are, who are, and he managed to inspire a couple of senators to introduce bills to reform what's known as the Medical Malpractice Mandatory Arbitration Act, an antiquated law in our books that essentially says that if you are a victim of medical malpractice, if you have a claim against a medical provider, whether that's a doctor, a nurse, an allied health professional, whatever it is, if you have a claim, you cannot bring your claim directly to court. You have to go to arbitration. And you might think, okay, that's fine. But then the law says that the cost of the arbitration is something that the victim has to front. And you know what the cost of arbitration is? Because the law also says that you have to bring in an arbitration panel that is certified according to a certain... This law was made, it was a special interest law for doctors to protect doctors from accountability. And so the cost of that arbitration will run from at least $40,000, but most likely into the 6 digits, into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you're unsatisfied with the arbitration, I'm not sure what happens after that. But even Judge Frances Tidinko Gatewood, in assessing one of the cases that came before her regarding the MMMAA, said that this law effectively shuts out the poor and the middle class from ever being able to see a claim through. And what exacerbates the problem is that you would think that at the very least, even if you could not redress your grievances through the court system, if you are a poor or middle class or even an upper middle class person who does not have $40,000 to $150,000 laying around in cash so that you can do an arbitration panel, you don't have access to the courts. You can't have your grievances redressed. You cannot hold a bad doctor accountable. And what does that mean for the rest of us? For the rest of us, especially for that bad doctor's patients, that bad doctor remains in practice. No accountability whatsoever. And it makes it worse that we have a Guam Board of Medical Examiners and a Guam Board of Nurse Examiners who have been unwilling thus far and for the past several years to rule in favor of victims who have brought claims before these two boards. You know, allowing the doctors and the nurses to police themselves is the same thing as allowing the police to police themselves. It doesn't make any sense. And what might be worse about allowing the doctors and the nurses to police themselves is the intertwined financial connections among them. For example, if you're on the Guam Board of Medical Examiners, and let's say you run a dialysis center, and you rely on referrals from a certain doctor to bring you money into your dialysis center, and that certain doctor has a complaint against him, is it in your financial interest to rule against that doctor? No. It's in your financial interest to rule against the victim. And so the deck is already stacked against victims, both on the regulatory side, meaning these examiner boards, and on the legal side, the litigation side, because of the law, because of the Medical Malpractice Mandatory Arbitration Act. 2 senators introduced 2 competing pieces of legislation. One was Tina Muñoz Barnes. What she wanted to do was institute fees and create a fund, and those fees would go into a fund, and that fund would pay for the cost of arbitration. The problem with that bill is that when they did the math, the annual amount in fees that would be paid into this fund would only be enough for like a couple of people at most per year to file claims and to have those and to have that arbitration paid for. That's not enough, because there are more than 2 people a year who file claims, and that should be alarming on its own. The other bill, and so the doctors loved that bill, the victim advocates didn't, understandably so. And then you had Therese Terlahi's bill. And Therese Terlahi's bill is the one where you had all those doctors going to the legislature saying that if you pass this bill, not only will you be screwing over the potential for doctors to come in, but you will also be forcing us to move our practice outside of Guam. That was the threat that they made to senators. And Therese Terlahi's bill was much more expansive in its reform. I can't remember if it did away with the arbitration panel, but I do remember that it provided for a screening panel over at the Superior Court. And I remember that the court said that they were not certain that such a screening panel could be something tenable because of the limited financial resources of the court. And I do remember that at the time, Therese Terlahi was saying, let's work together on this. Anyway, that went nowhere. I have no idea why Therese Terlahi never pursued that legislation or the amendments that would have been made so that doctors would be at least slightly satisfied and less concerned about frivolous lawsuits. But now is a time, now that there's a new Republican majority, and most of these senators I interviewed during the campaign, and most of these senators agreed that there should be reform to the Medical Malpractice Mandatory Arbitration Act. All of them agreed that people who are low and middle class should no longer suffer the injustice of being unable to hold doctors who maim them or kill their relatives and friends from being able to be held accountable. And so I'm going to rely on the words of these senators, the words that they promised back in the campaign, because so far the 38th Guam legislature has been doing a pretty good job. I know it's still very early to judge, but so far they've been doing a pretty good job. And I have to imagine that this group of senators, they're more skilled, they're more professional, they're more serious, they seem to be less political than the last legislature, will be able to, one of them, introduce a bill and they can take it from the Therese Terlahi bill and then just make changes to that bill that would begin to satisfy some of the concerns of some of the doctors. And you're not going to get all of them satisfied. And we know of at least one doctor, louder than anybody's business, who has ever said, whenever something affects this one doctor's, I don't know, emotions, sense of pride, ego, love of self, I'm not sure. You can count on this doctor to be loud and in your face and to try to bully your elected government into doing what special interest wants. And I say to you, senators, you need to grow a pair. You need to understand that the voters are much more powerful than that doctor or any group of doctors. And more importantly, that the right thing to do is always the right thing to do. And there should be no delay in doing the right thing. You know, if you want to see the difference between what is right and what is special interest, take a look at the picture of Asher Dean Lebowski. And don't forget that this entire thing started because this poor boy did not deserve to die. He should be with us now. He should be with us growing up. He should be, how many years has it been? 7. This boy should be 12 years old today. But on October 31, 2018, his life was ended at the hands of neglect and malpractice by medical providers, including nurses, according to a Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services independent report of the hospital. So, senators, think about that as you prioritize the fixes, the corrections that you need to make to the long-standing systemic issues and problems facing the government of Guam that affect us, the people of Guam. Don't forget about Medical Malpractice Mandatory Arbitration Act reform. Don't forget that all of us, at some point in our lives, are going to be patients, including all of you, senators. And don't we want some assurance that when we're cared for, when a loved one is cared for, that the law of the land protects us from negligence and malpractice? I beg of you, senators, do not pay attention to the loudmouths who will threaten you because all they're doing is protecting their special interests. And we should have nothing to do with those kinds of people any longer in this government. For Kandit News, I'm Troy Torres. You all have a wonderful and beautiful day. God bless you, and I love you all.